Welcome, everyone, and thanks for joining us for this discussion of Michael Truscello's Infrastructural Brutalism. My name is Derek Denman. I'm a postdoc in political science at the University of Copenhagen, and I'll be chairing this session today. I'm part of the Endemic Infrastructures Working Group within the Security and Context Research and Teaching Initiative. Endemic Infrastructures is led by Nicole Grove at University of Hawaii at Manoa. Unfortunately, Nicole had something come up suddenly and won't be able to join the event, but I do want to thank her. All of us in the group are grateful for her efforts forming and maintaining endemic infrastructures and really for making today's event a reality. So briefly, I want to say a few words to introduce endemic infrastructures. As one of the thematic working groups within Security and Context, endemic infrastructures sets out to examine the relationship between the politics of security and its intersections with data flows, technological systems, and the built environment. The project examines the circulatory logics of data-driven technologies of surveillance, security, and data capture, how these systems are shaping ongoing transformations of space, mobility, and conflict, as well as the ethical and practical implications of these transformations for people's daily lives. So it's with this collective project in mind that we're excited to welcome as our guest, Michael Truscello, and discuss his book, Infrastructural Brutalism, Art and the Necropolitics of Infrastructure, published by the MIT Press in 2020. Michael is an associate professor of English and General Education at Mount Royal University in Calgary, Alberta. His research interests include anarchism, the politics and poetics of infrastructure, petrocultures, and media studies. In addition to Infrastructural Brutalism, he has also co-edited the volume, Why Don't the Poor Rise Up? Organizing the 21st Century Resistance, and that was published by AK Press in 2017. To discuss Michael's work, we are also joined by Nisha Shah, a member of the Endemic Infrastructures Working Group. Nisha is an associate professor in the School of Political Studies at the University of Ottawa. Her work uncovers how and why infrastructures and artifacts come to take particular form and function within the normative and ethical frameworks of governance and war. Her work has appeared in many outlets, including Security Dialogue, Critical Studies on Security, International Political Sociology, among many other journals and edited volumes. So just quickly, a few notes about the format of the session. We'll start with Michael, who will have 20 minutes or so to tell us a little bit more about the book. And then Nisha and I will both take just a little while to pose a few questions. Michael will have some time to respond, and then we will have Michael answer a few questions from the audience. So please pose those questions through the Q&A function at the bottom of Zoom. We'll gather together some questions and try to get through as many of those as possible. So with that, I'll turn the floor over to Michael.
Thanks very much, Derek. I'm going to share my screen here. Thank you to the Endemic Infrastructures Group for the invitation to speak today. I am speaking from Treaty 7 territory near Calgary, Alberta. I think that location has actually significantly influenced the nature of this book. Being so close to the oil industry in Canada gives you a slightly different perspective on things. Let's see. Okay, so I opened the book with the chapter called the Paver of Modern Life as a deliberate allusion to the painter of modern life, which is a famous essay by Baudelaire, and it's sometimes referenced as the beginning of literary modernism. It's kind of the beginning of European artists accepting the modern as a viable subject for artistic representation. So I wanted to sort of hail that legacy and indicate that this is a book about industrial infrastructure through the lens of artistic media. So the book opens with J.G. Ballard's Concrete Island because I think it presents a nice sort of allegory for what's going to be discussed in the rest of the book. And it's a story about someone who gets trapped in infrastructure, in a space in between the highways, in kind of a literally within the infrastructure, and this is the focus of his struggle to escape from that space. And at one point, he becomes almost accepting of the sort of toxic space in which he finds himself trapped. So this becomes a kind of extended metaphor for talking about infrastructural brutalism. And I'm going to define that, but I wanted to sort of make it clear that, I'm looking at the necropolitics of infrastructure through the lens of various artistic media. So film and literature, photography, even some TV shows, and the occasional poem, as a way of eliciting the sort of multiplicities of infrastructure against what is typically the capitalist metric for infrastructure, the way in which our societies measure its usefulness or its necessity. It tends to be solely based on that capitalist metric and how it circulates commodities, how it accelerates primitive accumulation. So infrastructural brutalism as a concept in the broadest sense refers to the simultaneous historical realities of two things. One, the ecological collapse that appears to be in progress. In the book, I reference a number of scientific studies that, of the various ecological crises that are emerging and converging. And at the same time that that's happening, and at the same time that these ecological crises are caused primarily by capitalism, we have this unprecedented expansion of industrial infrastructure. So the past 10 years or so, and for the next 10 to 20 years, global capitalism has committed to an unprecedented expenditure on industrial infrastructure. Some of this expenditure means refurbishing infrastructure that is now failing, and some of it means building new infrastructure. So we've basically hit, this what some scientists call the sixth mass extinction event in the history of the planet. And instead of pulling back from urbanization, instead of even slowing it down a little bit, global capitalism is actually accelerating the commitment to industrial infrastructure with more pipelines, more paved roads, surprisingly, another revolution in large dam building. All of these things I sort of enunciate in the book, and so this is the particular brutality of the moment. And it's clear, of course, that capitalism cannot be the source of the solution for this. I would argue, as an anarchist, that the state form cannot be the solution to this either. And so, the end of the book is about what is to be done. The largest infrastructure project in the world right now is the Belt and Road Initiative. This is a massive undertaking by the government of China. This on its own is the largest infrastructure project in history. So that's just China. And what they are doing is building connections to Europe and the rest of Asia and parts of Africa with new rail lines and new ports. And this is obviously going to accelerate the circulation of goods And there's no question that this is going to be a massive ecological crisis. Despite, you're going to see sort of government propaganda presenting it as somehow a green initiative, but this is impossible. Obviously, to the other superpowers, there is a concern about what they're calling, infrastructure diplomacy, the kind of extension of Chinese influence in terms of new infrastructure projects. So there are any number of things that one of the things that I focus on in the book are the cultural ways in which the Belt and Road Initiative is being sort of unveiled. So you see new university programs in China that are devoted to creating graduates who would be experts of the Belt and Road and its policy goals. You see new portions of film festivals devoted to the countries of the Belt and Road Initiative. There have been photographic exhibits. There's been an exhibit of animators from the countries of the Belt and Road. So I'm kind of interested in that nexus of culture and infrastructure throughout the entire book. And this is another interesting example of how culture works, to acquire popular, support for a massive infrastructure project. There is part of the reason for calling it infrastructural brutalism is an actual historical connection with brutalist architecture that goes back to the post-war period when a group of French architects visited the United States looking for ideas for the reconstruction of France after the war. And one in particular who became kind of famous as a creator of modernist architecture, Le Corbusier, saw the large dams that the Tennessee Valley Authority had built and was inspired by their aesthetic and took some of this exposed concrete aesthetic back, and of course, built some apartments that became famous as an example of brutalist architecture. And I thought there was an interesting convergence there between infrastructure and architecture. So between infrastructure and a more general aesthetic. And it's something that we don't give much attention to, the aesthetics of infrastructure, even though it surrounds us in every way. And much like the story of the concrete island, it sort of entraps us as well. So each of the chapters of the book after the introduction have to do with a different genre of artistic media that foregrounds infrastructure. The first is about so-called drowned town fiction. So what I'm doing is matching an aesthetic consideration of infrastructure with social scientific facts, with history and so forth. So in part, that's because I think there's a value in the close reading of artistic representations of infrastructure and what it can tell us about infrastructure and its history and its present. So there's a surprising number of novels in American literature in particular about this phenomenon of the drowned town. So it's, when hydroelectric projects come to a place and have to drown a large area, for the reservoir. And there's a number of very prominent artists who wrote novels about this phenomenon. So you can see the example of Cormac McCarthy. His father was actually a lawyer with the Tennessee Valley Authority. with a very distinct connection to that massive undertaking of sort of electrifying the southern United States. You have many sort of poet laureates and other like acclaimed writers who eventually published novels about the drowned town fiction. And I generally look at American and Canadian novels in this sort of subgenre in terms of Mark Rifkin's idea of settler common sense. And that's the kind of pedestrian way in which infrastructure enacts a kind of settler jurisdiction, even in the absence of settlers. And so you see in many of these novels a kind of erasure of indigeneity. And, in some cases, they are sort of celebrating the TVA as bringing this unending progress in the form of large dams. And in some of these novels, of course, they're very critical. I've put Green Grass Running Water on this slide because it's the one example of an Indigenous author writing about the phenomenon of the dam, and one of the characters sort of critiques the very idea of the dam. And so there's I think an extended and useful consideration there of how infrastructure works in conjunction with colonialism. And that's a sort of topic that I return to at the end of the book as well. There's an entire chapter on the road movie, which is, of course, a subgenre that puts the actual infrastructure in its name. Surprisingly, the scholars of the road movie have little to say about the materiality of the road. There's much more fascination with, the vehicles that people use to escape society in these road journeys. And so in a general sense, I trace how the road movie engages liberal governmentality, and from the sort of, from the Wizard of Oz, actually, right through the 60s and 70s, the sort of classic road movies of that era, which often there's a quality of the whiteness of those road movies that erases the sort of racialized contours of road construction. And so I address that. And toward the end of the chapter, there's a discussion of the post-apocalyptic road movie, like in the Mad Max films. And it's kind of like a speculation about what happens when liberal governmentality disappears. There's a chapter on the photography of oil landscapes. So think of Edward Burtynsky, who's the photographer of this image. And I'm kind of interested here in how the types of infrastructure we build or allow to be built have particular kinds of ruins that will have to be dealt with at some point. And so these are the ruins of oil capitalism and some of the challenges that they present now or will present at some point in the future. So that's a kind of extended consideration of various photographers who have presented these energy landscapes and some of the possibilities for future ruins. And the final chapter has to do with death train narratives, everything from actual death trains. So going back to the 19th century, the death train narrative, it either has to do with the construction of the railway and the massive casualties associated with that construction, or the railway itself as a kind of conduit of mass death. So obviously the trains of the Holocaust, the Burma Railway, which had thousands of casualties in its construction, to a large extent using prisoners of war to build the Burma Railway. And then I sort of moved to the present and look at fictional death trains, such as the films Snowpiercer and Train to Busan. And there's a portion of that chapter on this comparison of Snowpiercer and Train to Busan that I've recorded as a video on my YouTube channel. It's essentially, for the most part, it's just translating the part of this chapter with some visuals. And I think, part of the usefulness of understanding these stories is understanding the ways in which infrastructure kind of constrains our attempts to move beyond this social order, to move beyond oil capitalism, or whatever you sort of want to use to describe this social order. So the constraints of infrastructure, and in these films, I think there are sort of ideas about what will be necessary to move beyond this society and its it's sort of suicidal construction at this point. In the conclusion is a discussion of what I'm calling Brezantic politics. So Brezant describes the shattering effect of an explosive. I'm talking about a politics of breaking apart things, not necessarily through the use of explosives, but it's basically advocating for foregrounding, unmaking the large parts of this experiment of modernity that is clearly dramatically unsustainable. So part of what we have to do moving forward, of course, is sort of retrofit certain infrastructures. But I think it's clear, based on the actions and histories of the state form and of capitalism, that there will be some forms of sabotage necessary. This is not a system that is simply going to step back from the brink because that's the smart thing to do. It's that is not its history, and that is clearly not what it plans for the future. If you look at, for example, the projections of oil and gas companies, looking at the new pipelines that they want to build, looking at their projections for growth, it's in their own documents, the fact that they don't care about climate science, and we know that they've sort of been ignoring it or obscuring it for decades now. So I wouldn't expect that to change. Part of this emphasis on sabotage and Brezantic politics, of course, is something that we've seen in radical politics all over the world, from a few years ago, people occupying airports in the United States to prevent Trump's Muslim ban from happening, to just last year in Canada, there was a series of railway blockages that was working under the hashtag of Shut Down Canada. And for a little over a week, mostly Indigenous protesters managed to shut down rail traffic across the country using this tactic of interrupting infrastructure. And it's so successful as a strategy that we've seen in many Canadian provinces and in dozens of states, new laws being passed to make the penalties for interrupting infrastructure much harsher, with higher fines and longer jail sentences and so forth. Here in Alberta, they're actually trying to make it the law that you can't even express support for people who are blocking infrastructure. So there's a recognition that these tactics work, but it should be a sign of what I discuss in the book in terms of continental philosophy. It's a sign of the suicidal state, right? It's a state sort of doubling down on the infrastructures that have brought us to the sixth mass extinction event in history, and it's pretty clear that they are going to, defend this infrastructural order as long as they can. So I guess I can stop there, and we'll have plenty of time for for questions. And I've sort of skimmed over like a lot of the detail in the book that of course I would consider important, but that's, I think, the broad view is what I've presented.
Thanks, Michael. Nisha, do you want to get the discussion started and pose a few questions?
Yeah, I just wanted to share screen, but I don't know if my computer is, oh, here we go. Okay. Oh, here we go. Sorry, technology. So I wanted to kind of thank Michael for writing this book, and I wanted to start the conversation off with a couple of stories that I think really draw out the implications of the book. And the first has to do with this tree that's outside my house. And for the last 5 years, I've been in a struggle with city officials where I live, because I want this tree cut down. It's not my tree, it's the city's tree. And the problem is that the tree, which is almost 80 years old, is surviving, but it's not thriving. And in fact, it's clearly dying. And I've become a seeming tree assassin to the town's arborist, because we're at loggerheads, because I've tried to argue that the reason for removing this tree is not my singular will for it to be destroyed, but a configuration of elements in which this tree is being made to die. So there's years of laying asphalt for road repairs. There's the development of the electricity grids that are running through the branches of the tree. And the previous owner's construction of a car pad that have actually stunted the growth of the tree's root system. So all of these together, I've tried to argue, are creating a situation in which the tree is kind of living a near death. It hasn't really got me that far, but I think it draws together all the different elements that Michael is drawing to. And then I wanted to pick up on one of the examples that Michael alluded to at the end of his talk. And I work at the University of Ottawa, but I live in Montreal. And about a year ago, I received this notification on my phone that the train that I usually take back to Montreal was canceled because of a rail blockade. And this was because of a protest to the Coastal Link gas line pipeline that was running through the territory of the Wet'suwet'en Indigenous First Nation in British Columbia. So there was a kind of a crisis on our WhatsApp or text feed, and there were mixed emotions, because on the one hand, we had political sympathies with the blockade, and there was a kind of poetic justice of interrupting one infrastructure as a way to demonstrate protest against another one, and draw out the kind of colonial legacies of infrastructure. But on the other hand, how are we going to get home, right? And I solved this problem because my partner had actually decided that the family was going to was going to spend the weekend in Ottawa, and he was at that moment driving. So I had a ride because he was using the road network to come and pick me up. So I think both of these examples draw out the evocative and kind of provocative contribution of Michael's analysis, and it draws out the political tensions we contend with a political architecture on which we so depend, but has become a blueprint for large-scale ecological and societal destruction. And to this end, I think Michael's book makes three really great contributions. One is that, the first is that it draws attention to the very materials of infrastructure. And this is not a metaphorical discussion of brutalism, it's a very literally concrete one. And it doesn't reduce the politics of ecological destruction to concrete, but it shows how concrete is a kind of historically situated material that arose and literally is embedded in the political circumstances in which it's become prominent, right? And this attention to materials, I think, doesn't treat them as static forms, but drawing off of Keller Easterling's notion of disposition and active forms, it looks at concrete as the very kind of substance in which infrastructure has become a form of life. So the way concrete is used to develop infrastructures of capitalist appropriation tied to progress, that involve also encroachment on the physical landscape and dispossession of different peoples. And then finally, I think one of the key contributions of the text is how it moves the discussion of infrastructure away from an epistemological question to an ontological one. What are the actual choices we have committed to shape our political and economic systems? A lot of the infrastructures that are described in the book are the core projects of public works. And I think then conversely, the ontological dimensions of the ontological move that's made in the book becomes really vivid in the action of kind of sabotage, or what Michael calls Bursantic politics, that in order to kind of create a different world, we actually have to engage in physical acts of destruction. So I think this idea of moving away from studying infrastructure as a new lens to help us understand politics, to understanding how infrastructure has been actually the way we've shaped our political societies is really interesting. So I have three really short questions. One has to do with the attention to materials and drawing out the way. I think you do a really good job in the book in showing how this commitment to concrete infrastructures explains the durability of the state. But at the end of the text alludes to this more kind of revolutionary politics in which we might actually use those materials to create, or we might destroy those materials to create a new world. And I wonder if we could also think about how the actual materials of infrastructural brutalism might participate in their own destruction. So you talk about Keller Easterling's notion of subtraction and retrofitting and reusing materials. How might concrete be used to kind of create the different kind of world, the one that acts against this destruction of nature that you describe in the book? The second question I have has to do with the notion of the suicidal state. And here I'd be really interested to hear you say more about the differential effects of infrastructural brutalism, because you draw attention to a lot of the class and race hierarchies in the book. And I wonder if rather than suicidal, it would be better to think about infrastructural brutalism as genocidal and tied to longer state histories of kind of colonial occupation, amongst others. And if that's the case, how might this change the kind of focus and practical acts of Bursantic politics that you describe at the end? And then finally, I just wonder if there is a larger criticism of infrastructure as a paradigm of political analysis and societal practice in your work. Like, with the emphasis on actual physical acts of destruction, is there a kind of hope for a post-infrastructural mode of analysis in your work? Derek, do you want me to read out Nicole's questions now?
Yeah, if you would, maybe we can have Nicole's and then we'll say a few. And then
Nicole unfortunately hasn't been able to join us today, but I'm going to read out. Nicole's first question follows from your discussion of the energy infrastructures of oil. And she's thinking about the ways in which infrastructural brutalism might reinvent itself in the move towards forms of energy that are sold from the outset as being more gentle, renewable, and humane. She asks whether you think there is a similar process happening in the way that something like the Green New Deal disavows its own infrastructural brutalism. In other words, how might infrastructural brutalism reinvent itself through the humanizing technologies of wind farms and solar fields, which also displace people and enact violence, but through progressive narratives about sustainability and a particular vision of what environmental justice should look like? Her second question is about a version of infrastructural brutalism that is transitory rather than obdurate. For example, the concrete island, given the highly technical nature of new developments. She's thinking here of a few examples, for instance, proposals to distribute floating homes to people in small Pacific Island nations as an answer to imminent sea level rise, or distributing 3D printing technologies to Palestinians so that they can reprint new houses when Israeli forces tear them down. These examples are different, but from this notion of infrastructure as global, communicative, and on the move, which the book is writing against. Is there a version of infrastructural brutalism that's temporary, that's found in things that are built to fail or to collapse? Or is the notion of infrastructure as obdurate and enduring beyond its use, even if it's repurposed, an essential component to the concept you're trying to develop?
Okay, so I think there's already a lot on the table for Michael to answer, and he might want to address some of those questions before I say any more and add any more to that. Does that work all right?
Yes, thank you. I'll do my best. There's a lot there. Those are great questions, and I hope that even if my answers are inadequate, I hope you follow up on those ideas, because I think there's a number of good ideas in those questions. Let's see, the production of nature. So infrastructure and the production of nature. If the science is correct and we are in a mass extinction event, and I've only seen one scientist say that we aren't, but I sort of hold that closely because it's a scientist who studies the history of mass extinctions. But if we are, then there's really no way that you can reverse it. It's a cascading collapse of ecosystems. And what we're probably looking at in the long term is what some scientists were talking about 10 or 15 years ago, the idea of the planet of weeds, right? A sort of we lose biodiversity. We've already lost a considerable amount of biodiversity. So on the one hand, there's that probably continuing march toward a less diverse world, biologically speaking. And I think that's the kind of nature that's being constructed by industrial capitalism primarily. And maybe that would be sort of accompanied by our attempts to either recycle or sort of recombine this new nature, diminishing capacity to exploit at the level that we've been exploiting, and instead turning more and more to trying to recover the debris, trying to make something from the debris. So the new nature is in a simple sense, one with just a lesser carrying capacity, one that is more monolithic, and that might be, we might already be like in that tendency for hundreds or thousands of years. Some of these things have, these are very complex systems interacting, and they're difficult to measure. but that's part of the reason, I guess, that I doubt that I will see some kind of post-infrastructuralism in my lifetime. But it makes me think that what we could see, it might be described as a sort of alter infrastructuralism. Our ongoing attempts to build like a new revolutionary infrastructure within and beyond and against the existing social order. So maybe not post infrastructuralism, because that will probably exist for a very long time, but I would like to see an alter infrastructuralism, building from within. We really don't have much choice but to engage in this. The question of the should it be called genocidal infrastructuralism instead of suicidal? To an extent, I do address that in the book, especially in the chapter on the death train narrative. It's very much focused on railway imperialism and the roots of that and the extension of that. But I think it's suicidal now because, in addition to the continuing genocide in places like Canada, for example, so there are genocides happening within that larger structure that is suicidal. Now it is the colonizers themselves who are implicated in the scale of this catastrophe, right? So, and I think it's pretty clear. I quote the former CEO of Exxon, Rex Tillerson, who was briefly the Secretary of State, I think, under Trump. And, a few years ago when he was asked about mitigating climate change and what Exxon was doing, to address climate change, he said, what good is it to save the world if humanity suffers? By which he basically meant, by humanity he meant his own pocketbook, I guess. But it's that kind of suicidal logic that I think is deeply embedded in contemporary colonialism, that basically the colonizers would rather destroy most life on Earth than give up the position of being the colonizer. It's a genuinely sort of suicidal, like, we're going to push this, we're going to extract as much as possible, as fast as possible, and even if that means killing most life on Earth, through climate change, through biodiversity loss, and so forth. So it's still, in that sense, I think, a suicidal state form, which, for those who aren't familiar with the phrase, it comes from continental philosophers like Virilio and Deleuze and Guattari and Foucault. They all talked about the suicidal state in the 1970s in terms of political parties like the Nazis and the Khmer Rouge. So it was this whole discussion about when a political party turns the state suicidal, and when a state becomes more suicidal than totalitarian. And I think that tendency is now embedded in industrial capitalist nation states, because it doesn't really matter who you put in charge, whether it's the sort of neoliberal party or the proto-fascist party. It's the same infrastructure is there, and both of those, liberals and conservatives, have the same commitment to maintaining that infrastructure almost at its current level. So if anyone thinks that like a carbon tax is going to solve the multiple ecological crises, I would suggest that that is, delusional. But that's the level of the discourse right now around infrastructure. So it's going to require more concerted direct action from radical actors to slow this thing down. I think your anecdote at the beginning was an apt one, and I'm guessing that if the issue is, can we change this social order in a dramatic way as is necessary to prevent, killing most life on Earth? Can we do that without inconveniencing, settlers, without inconveniencing whatever you want to call the sort of professional class? I would suggest that we would be waiting forever to achieve that kind of dramatic change without inconveniencing that a particular class of people in the society. There will never be an opportune moment like that. So what I think we need more of is more sort of organizing in ways that can support the people who have now been forced to become the front line against climate disaster, which in many cases, because of where the infrastructure is located, certainly in Canada, it is Indigenous people who have been forced, to become the front line, and we're going to have to change that dynamic with more settler collaboration on that front. Just see, there were a number of big questions in there, but let's see. The Green New Deal. I think one of Nicole's questions was about the Green New Deal. I think she's right that advocates of the Green New Deal will have to acknowledge the elements of brutality embedded even in that progressive idea. It's probably a kind of social transformation that most people are not prepared to make. And we actually saw a dry run of this with the Shutdown Canada railway blockades last week. There, what you saw within a few days of the railways being blocked was a number of reactionaries showing up and physically removing the protesters, and kind of, being given the room to do that by the RCMP and others, right? So that's where you need better organizing on the ground, more radical communities to be able to support those types of actions, those types of blockades, because otherwise the reactionaries will be allowed to run free and impose their violence at will. So it was kind of an interesting and useful trial for that 1 week last year to see what would happen, right? So the far right media outlets almost immediately advocated vigilante sort of violence against the blockade. Rebel and post-millennial and all of those sort of proto-fascist kind of media outlets in Canada, they almost immediately advocated for their followers to take matters into their own hands. And I think you'll see like much more of that in the future around more matters than not simply around infrastructure, but we're seeing it, even around the COVID lockdowns. Anyway, I don't want to get too far off topic, but I think the other thing related to Nicole's question, and this issue of like green capitalism, I think you can already see the oil and gas companies using incredibly deceptive techniques in presenting things as what they call carbon neutral or carbon neutrality. So, you know, instead of actually managing their greenhouse gas emissions, what they're doing is a form of like creative accounting and saying, oh, sure, the gasoline you're putting in your tank is carbon neutral because, and then they'll, you know, we're going to plant some trees over here, or, you know, anything that enables them to continue with this level of emissions and rate of extraction. And I think, you know, we've seen this for many years, but we'll probably see more of it, more creative accounting of the actual emissions. You know, Shell introduced like carbon capture, and when I looked at their projections, you know, they were saying, I think it's by 2030 or something, they were going to have a certain amount of carbon capture and storage. And I looked up their global emissions and compared it with the amount that they were saying in 10 years they're going to be capturing. And the amount that they were going to be capturing in 10 years was less than 1%. It was about 1/4% of their global emissions. You know, so people have to be sort of, I guess, educated on the extent to which these types of companies are going to be deliberately deceptive around, you know, in order to enable more extraction. I don't think they have any desire to diminish their rates of extraction. Yeah, there's a lot there, but I think I've been talking for a long time, so maybe I'll sort of pause and you can introduce other questions or comments if you want to respond.
Okay, thanks. I have just a few quick comments that I want to make and one question that I'd like to pose. So I mean, I do want to start out by saying that I enjoyed the book immensely, and I appreciate the amount of ground that it covers and depth that it engages with that ground. Really, from the opening reading of Concrete Island, which I'm an enormous fan of J.G. Ballard, to the genres of energy ruins and death train narratives, it seems like the book conveys a really unceasing encumbrance and hostility of infrastructural brutalism. But the question that I want to focus on primarily is about Brutalist politics. And I found this proposal a really refreshing change from the kind of genre that you note at the end of the book, the eco-opportunist. And I've also heard this sort of genre referred to as 11 chapters of Marx, one chapter of Keynes. And so, to put it bluntly, your argument is that this genre could use a dose of destruction. It would benefit from an ethos and material practice of shattering. And Brutalist politics offers that kind of formulation of what eruption looks like. And so while I'm sympathetic to the politics of infrastructural stoppage and counter logistics that you spell out in the book, I wonder if you'd elaborate on what political organizing looks like. This is something that you mentioned, sort of what the horizon of political organizing around this, what form it needs to take. But I also have a few questions about the kind of social solidarity that you say has to accompany this to protect against the forces of reaction. But also, it seems like there are kinds of social solidarity that arise within the sort of acts of dismantling and decommissioning and blockading that you speak to. So you talk a little bit about Nick Estey's work. And when I think about his book, Our History is the Future, I think about the passages where he talks about the ways in which pipeline blockades may kind of offer a glimpse into the future of the left. So at Standing Rock, we could see this kind of nascent formation of an anti-colonial and anti-capitalist coalition that was building bonds that would reach beyond the encampments against the pipeline itself. And so without doubt, there's an importance on the specific geography of the choke point blockade. That's an essential part, that the occupation occurs at a site of critical infrastructure. But I think it also seems like for Estes and some of the others you're engaged with, it's also a space in which militant anti-capitalist politics can grow and organize internally to a degree. And it's that internal dynamic that I'm curious about, and about how these kinds of political energies expand beyond the specific act of destruction, if there's something like a kind of constituent power at work in forms of obstruction, in dismantling, in decommissioning, and so forth. And so I'll ask also, would it be all right if we took one question from the audience in addition to that?
Sure. Can we answer sort of one at a time and
sure.
Okay. From there?
It's up to you.
Thanks. I guess in terms of organizing, so the book is primarily about a tactic, like foregrounding a tactic of unbuilding certain things, of preventing certain infrastructures from being built, and probably in the rare instance, actually sabotaging infrastructure. The kind of solidarity building, I think I basically sort of make a reference to the book that I co-edited, Why Don't the Poor Rise Up, which in the most general sense is a kind of anarchist communist work, even though it has within it people of different political stripes. It's some anarchists, some Marxists, and so forth. But in the most general sense, I would fall back on that kind of social organizing, which includes the sort of federative principle, that if you can build local sort of worker organizations, you can federate at the larger scale and build internationally from there. But in part, I'm not sure if that kind of scale of political action will continue to be possible. Maybe it might be decades before this actually happens. But I'm just thinking if a certain kind of federalism is going to become very difficult in the near future, like not only materially difficult, but maybe ideologically difficult to convince people of the possibility of that federative principle. It could actually become a situation of fragmentation instead, like political fragmentation into smaller units of independence movements and things like that. I think one of the benefits of organizing around opposition to these various pipelines, especially in North America has something like, of all the proposed pipelines, something like half of them are in North America of future proposed pipeline building. And I think one of the things that it's done is sort of brought settler radicals, sometimes like anarchists and Marxists, who some indigenous radicals refer to as the white left. It's brought more of those settler radicals into collaboration with indigenous radicals, and I think that's been very generative over the past 10 or 20 years. Like because decolonization is such an essential component of all radical politics. So I think those collaborations have been very productive and probably will continue to be. The challenge, though, it's still, and maybe we saw this at Standing Rock, and maybe we've seen this with Wet'suwet'en in northern BC, is that so many of these infrastructure projects are in very remote places. And so you have increasingly urbanized settler populations that might find it challenging to take up a regular presence in these remote locations to oppose pipeline construction. The other reason that I don't just sort of lean on, oh well, why don't we just go break pipelines or whatever, probably because they would be repaired within weeks of someone breaking them. Like the interference here has to be about more than simply can we break stuff. It's literally like the Wet'suwet'en are doing. Literally living in the path of the pipeline. Now that in itself, again, they can build around you, but hopefully what we see in the coming years is more power to First Nations in Canada to determine what gets done with their territory. And so hopefully that, contributes to the challenges that the oil and gas companies have building pipelines over multiple First Nations territories. So I in the general sense, the social solidarity is based on anarchist communist principles, but I'm one of those leftists, I guess, who recognizes that there will be multiple tendencies, in whatever organizing space you're in, and I would much rather we, in some sense, win something than break down over certain specifics of one's organizing. But anyway, I would advocate for anarchist communism, and I had some things in the final chapter to say about, like, especially based on Kristen Ross's last book about the TAZ, the ZAD, the Zone to Defend, in France, and the TAV in Italy, and some of the lessons from those experiments in preventing infrastructure projects. So I would sort of refer to that. If I haven't mentioned it already too, there's an open access version of the book on the MIT Press website. So if you can't or don't want to pay for the book, there's an open access version for free. Sorry, we can go to the next question, or if I haven't answered something you want, then just let me know. That's fine.
No, I think you spoke to it directly. I want to get to some of the audience questions, so I'll just read the first one. In your book, you write about dams, roads, and pipelines. However, low carbon infrastructures like wind factories and its associated infrastructures, for instance, roads, power grids, etc., are not unlike conventional energy sources in their upstream and downstream ecological impacts, and to a lesser extent, their immediate surroundings. Do you consider infrastructures such as industrial wind factories to be a form of infrastructural brutalism?
Yeah, this is, it's one of those questions that probably leads to, are you like an anti-civ anarchist or something else? I've really tried to deal with this issue in a kind of short-term tactical sense. Like, it would be a minor miracle if we could, over the next 10 years, reduce greenhouse gas emissions by, say, 20%. Even though the science says that, we have to do much more than that. So I'm kind of addressing this in terms of thinking of massive social change. It's kind of like turning an 18-wheeler on a lake of ice. It's going to be messy, and it's probably not going to live up to the precision that many leftists have, with their ideas about how change can happen. This is why I'm basically saying we sort of, from the ecological standpoint, we have to sort of break things first and figure out later how to build something better. But so yes, wind farms, all of the so-called renewables have a measure of brutality built into them. It's like, was it last year when people were talking about lithium imperialism? So maybe the imperialists move from dominating foreign countries for their oil to dominating foreign countries because they have large lithium reserves, and that'll be part of the batteries for cars, electric cars, or whatever. I would say there's still a measurable advantage to using wind as a power source or solar as a power source. Just even with, there's a measure of brutality in it. But if you compare that with what the global capitalists are sort of putting forward as the preference, they are not only continuing to extract oil and gas, but they are very much pushing nuclear as the thing that will sort of satisfy our energy needs and, in their terms, diminish greenhouse gases. And I think that is insane, but that's so compare nuclear with wind and geothermal and other forms of renewables. To some extent, we might have to look at, things that are less brutal, even though there's a measure of brutality in them. Just because you're talking about 8 billion people, and even, let's say maybe 3 billion are sort of industrial capitalist consumers, it's still not going to be easy to just revert to like hunter-gatherer societies or something like that. Like the change is not going to happen that way. We have to go through the existing infrastructure. We can't simply go around it. And I would say, like in the book, I basically return to nuclear as the particularly problematic one. Not at all a solution to energy needs, something that should be expertly decommissioned as soon as possible. But then you look at the Belt and Road Initiative, and they are building dozens of new nuclear reactors, as just one example of where nuclear is continuing to expand. It's not contracting.
Okay, thanks. I have another question that's in a little bit different vein. It's about aesthetics. So the question is that you use a variety of art forms in your book: novels, movies, photographs. In your talk, these art forms seem to serve mainly as examples of concepts you had already formulated. Are there any examples of ways in which the art changed your concepts or challenged your thinking about brutalism and infrastructure? What was the relationship between art, which generally tries to avoid simplification in favor of complexification, and the development of your arguments in the book?
Well, I think if you look at the amount of space in the book that's devoted to close readings of literature and photography and film, that is performing the multiplicities of infrastructure. Like that close reading is the performance of the opposite of this sort of simplification of capitalist metrics. So the book is demonstrating that by bringing you into close proximity with these books and films. So it's not. I wouldn't say that it's simply I had an idea and now here's a book to demonstrate it, because many of the works of art produce certain intangibles, certain ambiguities in what they're saying about infrastructure. They're not making academic arguments about things, and that's fine. I mean, that's part of what we lose when we submit to capitalist metrics every time we assess what an infrastructure can do for us. So, there are some examples that are not necessarily a statement of what I believe. I'm not an animist, but I think some of the things that Nick Estes or others have said about water are valuable to the way we behave in relation to infrastructure, even if I don't personally believe that there is a spirit in the water. I mean, there's things like that are sort of pushing the possibilities of how we think about infrastructure, but not necessarily making like a narrow academic argument about it. The documentary "The Pearl Button," I think, which opens the chapter on water infrastructure. It's a fascinating, beautiful documentary, and a horrifying one as well. But I'm not, I'm not talking about it in detail simply to make like a narrow point about hydroelectricity or something like that. I think there's sort of value in the way that these artistic media are not constrained by the usual engineering or capitalist discourses. I'm trying to think of the Still Life, the Chinese film from a few years back that takes place in the context of the building of the Three Gorges Dam. There's a scene in that film in which two characters are talking in front of a statue that's the Chinese symbol for prosperity, and eventually that sort of concrete structure was torn down. But in the film, it blasts off like a rocket ship in a kind of magic realist moment. And I go on to talk about how infrastructural brutalism extends to extraterrestrial space. The outer space infrastructure is very much an issue right now. You had scientists saying like we should leave 75% of outer space alone as a kind of wilderness. Please don't colonize like everything in outer space. There's not much in the film to suggest that that's the specific statement of having this magic realist moment of a concrete symbol for prosperity blasting off into space in this kind of unusual interruption of the film. But I kind of use that like jarring moment, that magic realist moment, to think about other possibilities for the extension of infrastructural brutalism, right? So I'm hoping that readers have moments like that where I've given them enough of the text, or I've shown them a photograph, or I've recounted enough of a film so that they can have those moments of maybe more speculative thinking about infrastructure. So that's, I guess, how I would answer that.
Okay, thanks. There's one more question that I think, to just state it very briefly, it's asking to think a little bit about the difference between Brisantic politics and the sort of incessant appeal to disruption that we hear within capitalism today. So the question asks, Brisantic politics, as you have articulated, it here seems like it might be consonant with capitalism itself. As Marx famously argued, capitalism relies on perennial creative destruction and explosion. And indeed, we hear so often about disruption. And so I'm just wondering if you could say a little bit more to distinguish the way that the kind of ideology of disruption that we hear invoked constantly to create new spaces of profit accumulation differs from how you're thinking about Brezant's.
Yeah, I mean that's a good point, and I do try to address that in the book because for a couple of reasons. I mean, there is the idea of creative destruction that capitalists use to justify all of the self-imposed crises that they create. It's essentially a philosophy of, you have to break some eggs to make an omelet or something, and it just so happens that the people who always get broken are the working class in this so-called creative destruction. So I don't want to associate Brezantic politics with that, and I certainly don't want to associate Brezantic politics with the current far right fascination with accelerationism, which is a fascist sensibility that says that they want to break down society as fast as possible to bring about a kind of civil war in which they assume that their side would win. So I gesture at these things in a couple of ways. I mention I think it's the beginning of the conclusion. There's a quotation there from Deleuze and Guattari, and they talk about how if you break apart a society too fast, it becomes suicidal. And I think I offer the Khmer Rouge as an example of this. This is definitely not the kind of thing that I'm advocating, where you had this attempt to move the clock back to year zero, and what ensued was a genocide. I'm definitely not talking about those two tendencies. What might require more discussion amongst leftists is, specifically what locations of infrastructure, which choke points are ideal targets for slowing down the circulation of commodities, for slowing the process of primitive accumulation, because generally speaking, what I'm talking about is a departure, a temporary departure that allows us to buy some time. I think we're talking about buying time for better organizing. We won't win without better organizational capacity. It's the thing that we don't really have right now. And the problem is that certainly in the ecological sense, we can see, we only have whatever. They keep moving the timeline, but maybe there's 10 to 20 years optimistically before things probably accelerate in their collapse. And I also acknowledge in the book that we're talking about a future that will be brutal, but we can make it less so. That's really what we're talking about. Like, if we're in a mass extinction event, then we're talking about a cascading collapse of ecosystems that you can't really reverse, but you can still make better decisions. We can still commit less violence against the future with decisions today. So, the emphasis of Brezant's is on, I give some examples, like unbuilding. Some things will have to be expertly decommissioned. You can't sabotage a nuclear reactor. That takes several years and an estimated maybe $1 billion to, under the best conditions, to decommission a nuclear reactor. So in some cases, we will need things to be expertly decommissioned. Some of the unbuilding might include simply interrupting some things from being built in the first place. So the activism around stopping new pipelines is a perfect example of Brutalistic politics, and not at all one that feeds into some kind of fascist accelerationism. It's simply, the climate science actually says that in order to avoid the 2 degrees warming above baseline, we would have to stop building new carbon infrastructure by 2018. So everything after that is it's insanity. But if you look at the figures that I provided in the book, it is the case that there are pipelines being built around the world that will be in operation for decades once they are built. So simply preventing some from being built, from being begun in the first place, that is a kind of Brutalistic politics as well. There's, like, I think last year we had the example in Tennessee of that right-wing guy who, I think he was trying to blow up a 5G cell tower or something like that. And, he blew himself up in his own RV. That's the kind of stuff that kind of exists outside of a collective program of solidarity. It's just one troubled individual who decides to blow up some infrastructure. That kind of stuff is not Brutalistic politics. Like, Brutalistic politics should be in the explicit advance of a kind of social solidarity. I'm not sure if that's if that's enough, but and I'm not sure if the questioner has read the last chapter, but again, you can download it for free if you want. I've got some examples in there. Like, there are some things like oil pipelines, I'm not even sure that we should be sabotaging them because of the environmental destruction that follows the act of sabotage, and the fact that within weeks or months they will have repaired the pipeline. Like, in the case of oil and gas, there might be other pressure points that are better places to attack, either with political pressure or some other organizing. So it shouldn't, Brutalistic politics should not be seen as just like, as anarchists like to say, make, total, destroy. It's not that. It has to, it has to be, to be effective, it has to be more considered, more strategic than that.
Okay, thanks. I think that really crystallizes that distinction between disruption and the Brutalistic politics. As you were answering it, another question came to mind for me, and it's a little bit different. It's more conceptual than a lot of these sort of tactically and strategically focused questions. But it's particularly around the term necropolitics, which features very heavily in the book and draws on Achille Mbembe's work. But I also noticed a kind of distinct direction that you seem to be headed in, where as you were responding to the question, the focus on the brutality of cascading collapse, the kind of departure that needs to buy us a little bit of time from an absolute eco-catastrophe comes out. And this sounds like kind of a different problematic than the one Mbembe's engaged in, where he's very focused on what he terms war machines, or the relation of late modern occupation. And so within his discussion, there is some infrastructure is addressed to some degree in the kind of spatial fragmentation of necropolitics that he's talking about. But I hear all kinds of concept creation going on in your work that's building on or drawing from other thinkers as well, like the discussion of settler nostalgia, protocological control, ontological toxicity, and as you've discussed in response to some of Nisha's questions, the suicidal state. And so I think my question is, where do you aim to push Mbembe's concept of necropolitics further? And then in part, to what extent does the discussion of necropolitics set out in a new direction from Mbembe's work, especially with your focus on protocols and techniques?
Yeah, I guess in general, it's just a matter of emphasis. My general conception of maybe the last century or two, there's a quotation in the book from an American historian about the beginning of the era of extracting oil in the United States, and he says, like, basically that there was like this exuberance in like the joy of destroying things in that era, in this late 19th century, really systematic drilling for oil. And I think in that sentiment, there's a broader idea that basically the state and capitalism have dominated both construction and destruction. Maybe the state achieves a kind of apotheosis or something in terms of destruction with the atomic bomb, with the capacity to destroy on that scale. And in the past few decades, we've seen capitalism dominate construction in what they would call development. I'm thinking of Bill Gates' 2013 essay on the fact that in a 3-year period, China poured more concrete than the United States did in the entire 20th century. That's like this committed sort of state capitalist control of what gets built and what gets demolished. And so in that broader context, we need more autonomous communities with the sort of capacity to build and in some cases to destroy, outside of capitalist logistics. So that, that's the kind of broader sort of concept that is behind the book. And in terms of necropolitics, I think for the most part, I just wanted to fill an absence in the literature. Like there wasn't very much discussion of how infrastructure kills. In the United States alone, you have approximately 1 million non-human animals killed on paved roads every day. In the last 30 years, as a vertebrate in the United States, you are more likely to be killed on a road than by a hunter. There are all kinds of these statistics that I present throughout the book to show the death toll of infrastructure, even though it continues to be dominantly framed as a marker of progress of mobility and connectivity and so forth. So in part, I was just engaging Mbembe with the desire to sort of fill that absence in the literature on infrastructure studies. Some of it was fairly straightforward in that way.
Okay, thanks. I think that brings us to the end of our time. So thank you for your time and for telling us about the book. And I'll let you have the last word if you'd like to.
Well, thanks very much to Endemic Infrastructures for the chance to talk about the book. I kind of wish we had more opportunity for like back and forth discussion here. I feel like I just had these questions dumped on me and then I ramble for 20 minutes. But because I really do, I sincerely appreciate your questions. There are some very very insightful comments in those questions, and I hope that that you sort of follow up those questions with, in your own writing, in your own publications. Like there's a lot to digest in those questions that we couldn't possibly do comprehensively here, but I do very much appreciate the engagement with the book, which was several years in the making. So, I appreciate that very much. Thank you to you both.